No, that was before my time. My goodness, I'm just a young guy. Well, granddaughter, we're here today on what I'll refer to as the Meiser Farm from now on in this little episode we're filming.
Which one is that? That's Uncle Brad's?
That's Uncle Brad is farming it now, but I'll give you the early history of it this afternoon. And we'll start with about 1900. And in 1900, this land was broken out of sagebrush, and they started farming wheat here in about that period of time.
This used to be sagebrush?
Why, yes. My dad says that when this country, let me give you a little more history of the country since we went back to that. Before this was farmed, it was all grassland, and I believe it had sagebrush on it. But some of the native plants, some of the plants we have now and weeds we have now weren't here in the early day. Mm-hmm. They were introduced later on. Right. But actually, before this was farmed in the latter part of the 19th century, which would be the 1850 to 1900. This was an area that was traversed by the Indians spring and fall, because they would live in the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains or in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. And this big desert in between those two ranges of mountains had a little bit of water scattered over it. There was a lake at Clovis, there was a lake at Scootney, which is out west of where we are now. And Dad tells that the Indians came through here just traveling to the Columbia River, so where they fished, and to the foothills of the mountains where they hunted.
The Cascade or the Bitterroot?
Well, I think in both cases. Okay. They kind of traveled between the two, as I understand. Yeah. And then, of course, the railroad came in the 1890s, and I think the Indians actually traveled through here some up in through the early 1900s. Mm. And it probably had a lot of sagebrush, and the Palouse country, which is east of here, supposedly was covered by tall grass about 4 or 5 feet tall, all over the hills. And,
oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. A little higher rainfall there. Anyway, does that answer that question?
Oh, yeah. When did they decide to make it farmland?
Well, in 1900 is when it was broken out, and they started farming wheat here in about that period of time. And there was homesteads built, and the house that my grandpa Meiser lived in was built in 1901. It's over here about a mile from where we sit now. And actually my ancestors didn't come to this part of the country until about 1913. And my great-grandfather came and bought some land. Actually, this land we're standing on. And then in 1915, 4 of his sons came, and he farmed as F.H. Meiser and Sons. And of course, they started farming with horses and pulling all the farm equipment with livestock. And about, these dates aren't exact, but in about somewhere in the 1920s, the horses became obsolete and the tractors came into the country. And one of the first tractors that my grandfather bought was a Cat, actually made by Holt Caterpillar starting in 1913, and I think they purchased one sometime in the late 1920s. And they farmed the farm for a few years with that, after sold the horses off, and they didn't have to put up hay and feed the horses all winter like they had to prior to that.
So you said that there's like no water here. How did they farm then?
It was very dry country, and so it was difficult. And when they first started farming this country, some of the newer equipment hadn't been developed, and they didn't really know exactly how to farm it. And the first cultivators they used were what you call a moldboard plow. And that moldboard would turn the soil clear over when they pulled it with the horses. And it covered the trash and the stubble. And when the wind blew, dirt would blow. And then later on, they decided we can't do that anymore. And they figured out a way to keep the stubble from the previous crop up on top of the ground, because they only grew a crop every other year. They would grow a crop and then they'd fallow it, and then they'd grow another crop. And the reason for that was that they had to conserve moisture for 2 years to be able to grow a crop. But they had to keep the land from blowing, so we went away from the moldboard plows, which there's one similar to what they used right down there. They started disking and sweeping, which left more of the stubble and weeds on top. And then they invented a machine called a rod weeder to keep the weeds off of it during that summer period. And when the weeds would grow up, they would pull this rod weeder through the soil, and it had a revolving rod on it to keep it from clogging, and it'd kill the weed, cut the weeds off at the root. And that way they could keep this what they call a summer fallow clean for that year. And then they would seed it in the fall and harvest it the next summer.
So still, if there's no water, then how did the plants grow? Did they just rely on rain?
Well, this area had a rainfall average of about 7 to 9 inches a year. And by doing that summer fallow practice, they maintained some moisture that fell during the crop year and then in the summer fallow year. And normally that would give them enough moisture to grow this next crop.
Okay.
So this is a low yielding area, Franklin County, as well as some of Adams County. And the yields in those days was 15 to 25 bushels per acre. We'll talk about some of the equipment, including that caterpillar. We have pictures of that caterpillar pulling the combine, and we'll insert in this film. So anyway, in about the mid-30s, I believe they bought the first caterpillar called an RD6. And, I've been in the mid-40s. No, in the early 40s. We'll have to edit that. In the early 40s, they bought a caterpillar called a RD6. And as I was growing up in the early 40s, I'd come to the farm with my dad, and I would ride with him a half a day on the caterpillar, bouncing along, looking at the coyotes and the mice and the hawks as they followed along with the tractor sometimes.
Why'd they follow it?
Well, the mice would run out, and the coyotes and the hawks would have their lunch, and the tractor and the plow would stir up the mice, so they had an easy chance at getting their dinner. Now they grew crops, and the wheat did grow, and they had to harvest it. So let's talk about the harvesters. The harvesters, probably we have some pictures of them, the early ones and some of the later ones. But the first harvester that was on this farm that I know of was pulled by there was a harvester pulled by the horses. And then there was a harvester pulled by that Cat 75. And then the ORD6 was pulling a John Deere 36. After John Deere and Holt purchased each other, they changed the name from Holt to John Deere. So it was a John Deere 36 pull combine, and you had to have 3 people to run it. There was a header puncher that kept the header up and down with a wheel, and the driver of the caterpillar, And then there was what they called the machine man. He would stand up on top and oil the bearings that needed oiling and make sure everything was running properly. And they had a bulk tank on them at that time. Prior to that, they would sack the wheat and right on top of the combine coming out of the chute and sew the sacks and slide them down a slide onto the ground. And then they pick them up later. But my recollection is it had a bulk tank on it, and the truck would pull under and empty the bulk tanks ever periodically. So that was the first combine, and that was used through the 40s. And in late 1940s, like 47, self-propelled combines were coming into being manufactured. And they had their own motor on them and didn't have to be pulled by a tractor. And the very first one that we had, we purchased after our neighbor had run it for a year. And it was called a Massey 21. And it had a Draper header on it. I'll tell you kind of a little story about combines here. After we used it for 1 year, some men from Montana pulled into our yard right after harvest one year. And they wanted to buy our combine because they had a big mustard crop in Montana, and they were needing combines so they could get their big crop harvested in Montana. And so my mom was a little reluctant to sell it. She told Dad when the guy was trying to buy it, she told Dad, well, maybe we won't be able to get a hold of another one, and we need a combine for next harvest. Well, the guy reached in his pocket and pulled out his billfold and pulled out a $100 bill and handed it to her and said, "Man, would this make the difference?" So she grabbed the 100 and they made the deal. Anyway, they were able to get a new combine the next year. It was a John Deere rather than a Massey, not Ferguson at that time. It was a John Deere 55. It had a 12-foot header on it, and that's what we harvested with for a year or two. And then from there we had a succession of John Deere combines. From the 55s we graduated to 95s, and then they came out with a hillside model that leveled itself on the hills. It was supposed to save grain when you were going up and down and on the side of the hills, because the grain would all slide to one side of the combine. It would overload the separator and waste grain out the back. So the hillside was used to level the combine. The wheels would stay on the ground and the combine would level, and it was supposed to save grain. Well, I don't think we had enough hills on our farm, but the hillside model was a fad, I guess, or a new thing. So we had one of those. And then we graduated to 105 combines. We used to run 2 combines, but when the 105s came out, they had enough capacity that we could harvest our small farm acreage with one combine, and we'd harvest about 1,000 acres a year. It took about 3 weeks, and we had 2 trucks that hauled the grain to town. I would drive truck, and sometimes I drove combine, but mainly I drove truck and hauled the grain to town. When I was 15, 16 years old, I was able to do that. So the truck I used to haul the wheat to town when we were harvesting in the 1950s was a 1941 Ford truck. No, excuse me, 1946 Ford. And it had a serial number on it of 90 something. And the reason the serial number was so low, during World War II, all the truck manufacturers manufactured equipment for the war that we fought in Europe, and mostly in Europe. And my grandfather bought one of the very first trucks after they switched back to domestic production. So therefore the serial number on it was less than 100. And that's the truck that I used up through the 1950s. Of course, we had other trucks also. But it met a fiery death because we had it stored in an old machine shed that was on the farm. And this was in the 1970s. And I was always going to restore it to its original condition because it was kind of beat up by then. But there was a burning barrel near this shed, and somehow they were burning something in the barrel. And either a cat was in the barrel and caught on fire and jumped out and ran into the shed, or some ashes landed on the shed and it started it on fire and burned up the building and the truck. And there wasn't much else in the building at that time, but it burned it clear to the ground. So that was the end of the 1941 Ford. No, Ford. I made a mistake. 1946 Ford. 1.5 ton truck. I would go to the field and we'd unload the combines while the combines were still threshing and going down the row threshing. And I'd drive alongside, and the combine operator would open the lever that unloaded the grain into the truck. And if I was lucky, I kept the truck under the chute and didn't spill any on the ground. And we'd dump about 3 times, about 50 bushels or 60 bushels at a time. So when the truck was full, it had 180, 200 bushels in it. And then I would head for town. And I was only 4 miles away to the elevator downtown where we dumped the grain. And then I'd rush back to get the next load. And we'd do that all day long. And I'd sometimes haul 13 or 14 loads a day to town. So I was on the move all the time. It was hot. We had the hemp canvas water bags on the truck, and the evaporation off of that canvas would keep the water cool, so I could drink water all day long to keep cool. Well, I've told you a lot about this farm, and basically this farm is where my roots are. As I grew up here, and I worked the farm all through the years, and so the land we're standing on is my roots. I could never get away from it, so I'm still here, and my son Brad is doing the farming now, and things have changed a lot because we have it under irrigation now, and we'll talk about that later. But I'm glad to have had the heritage to grow up on a farm like this and have the experiences I had over the years and be able to provide for my family as I stayed in farming in my whole life. So I just am a farmer, that's all. I'm slobbering. Don't put that in.